Good evening, those in the already joined us. Just going to wait a few more minutes for people to come in. There are up to 40 people at the moment. Some people coming in, we're up to 50. It's a good number for a Thursday evening. I hope you like the background, Kelly. I put myself in the role of a bug in the grass.
Actually ties into one of my points very well.
Give it one more minute, I think. Right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this Nature Friendly Farming Network webinar on beneficial beetles, helping crops, pastures and soil in the Southeast. I'm Stuart Harris, the Southeast England Sustainable Farming Officer for the Nature Friendly Farming Network covering Kent, Sussex, Surrey and Essex, and I will be your host and keeping an eye that everything goes smoothly. For those of you who don't know, the NFFN is a farmer-led membership organisation that supports farmers who want to restore the balance between farming and nature. If you want to find out more, please visit our website and I'll pop a website link in the chat. So although this webinar is aimed at farmers and landowners in the Southeast, please don't worry if you're not, as I'm sure what we'll learn tonight will apply to you and your farm location. In a moment, I will introduce our guest speaker for this evening, but before I do, I'll run through some quick webinar etiquette. So just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded for those not able to join us now and for future reference, and will be later uploaded onto our YouTube channel. If you could save any questions for later, I'll pop them in the chat, that would be great. And also please keep your cameras and microphones off if not already done so, but be ready to turn them on for the Q&A session. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Kelly Jowett from Rotherhithe Research, to learn about beneficial beetles in farm systems, from predatory beetles that control pests in crops to dung beetles that reduce pests in pastures and improve our soils. Dr. Kelly will explain how beetles contribute to integrated pest management practices to maximize beetle abundance, and how to monitor beetles on your farm. Kelly is an entomologist working on design of cropping systems and landscapes to reconcile crop and livestock production with biodiversity and ecosystem services. She has a particular interest in the functional biodiversity of carabid and dung beetles and working with farmers to apply her research. Kelly completed her PhD on the modelling of carabid beetles distributions in farm landscapes towards effective natural enemy pest control. She has an MRes in Global Food Security and Development and a BSc in Environmental Conservation. She also has expertise in agricultural entomology, forestry, agricultural systems, and communications. So I think we've got a very experienced, knowledgeable speaker tonight. So without further ado, over to you, Kelly, and thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. I'm honoured to be here tonight. I'll try and share my screen. Let's see. Is that showing up for everyone?
Yep, that's good.
Yep, you see the first slide. Okay, right. Let's start it. So, clicking through. Yes, there we go. So I'm going to start right at the beginning, and I know a lot of people who will be attending this webinar interested in the Nature Friendly Farming Network will be familiar with a lot of these terms, but just to put things in context and kind of get us the broad view before we narrow down into the beetly aspects. So we start with beneficial insects in farm landscapes, and a lot of the time when we're working as scientists on beneficial insects, we think in the terms of ecosystem services. Now, the one that gets all of the press is pollination, and I will mention briefly that the original pollinators were in fact beetles, way back in the mists of time. But there's a range of different insects that do this service, not least of which bees, flies, butterflies. And then down to pest and weed control. Now, there's a whole range of invertebrates that carry out these services as well. But I'll be focusing tonight on the beetle aspects. And then nutrient cycling and soil structure underpinning all of that productivity of crops and pastures. And all of these services that are natural things that happen in ecosystems are all underpinning the productivity of the crop. And they're doing that in a way that has evolved over eons in a balanced system that adds up to sustainable yield. Now, we might not see that topped out yield that is sometimes apparent, but we get the yield over time in a sustainable way, which it is becoming more and more evident that farm systems in the past have not been doing this in the most sustainable way. And one of these aspects is that we have seen a major decline in these services. Now, in absolutely no way am I blaming farmers, but when we look at the data from a worldwide decline of insects, that biggest wedge there is intensive agriculture, and this is worldwide. Then we see pesticides, because that's not always associated with intensive agriculture, and then a lot of kind of littler aspects of fragmentation of habitats, other kind of climate effects as well. And this has had a big impact on the ecosystem services. So we're seeing a decline in pollinating insects and predators of crop pests. And the statistics on the screen here are from the latest UK State of Nature report. So this is relevant to the UK. And I've highlighted on the little graph there some of the insects most in decline and what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, which is the carabid beetles and the dung beetles. And starting on a slightly depressing note, but to bring us up to that there are things we can do. We know about these insects. We have a lot of data on some of them, and we know that we can alter farm landscapes to boost their numbers and boost the amount of species that we have. And I think the first point that I would make is thinking about things not in the way that humans work and how we see how farm systems work, is thinking of it, shrink yourself down to the size of an insect and look at your farm anew. How do those habitats link together? How do insects use these habitats over time. I'm going to come back to a few of these aspects, but one of the main things is that insects have both a seasonal pattern of migration and also overwintering habitats. They have breeding cycles. Sometimes these are annual, sometimes these are more over and over within the same season. But the big thing about insects that we sometimes overlook as humans is that over their life stages, they have very different needs. So often they'll go from eggs to larvae to pupa to adults. And all of those things, all of those stages need different things out of farm habitats. So I'll take you through a few of those concepts as we go along. But starting the show with carabid beetles. Now, as Stuart mentioned, I did my PhD on carabid beetles. So essentially, I spent 4 years of my life studying these with great intent. So I do know rather a lot about them. Carabid beetles, that I'd like to say they're the hyenas of the insect world. They're pretty much scavengers of all kinds of systems. They are quite adapted to changing environments, which is what a farm habitat is. If you think of how the crops cycle over the year, all of these habitats are quite changeable, and carabids have adapted to that niche. Worldwide, there are around 40,000 species. In the UK, we have around 350 species. And of those, 30 are really abundant in farmland. And you can see the statistics up on the screen. I won't read those out to you, but they have been proven to control a range of pests and also weed seeds in crops. And there's not only suppressive effects whereby those beetles being in that environment are suppressing the pest outbreaks by eating such things as eggs and larvae before they become a problem in the crops. But they're also reactive, so they can actually make their way to a pest outbreak, in some cases actually sniffing along snail trails. That is one of the things that one of the beetles does. So I mentioned there's around 30 species that are common in farmland, and of those species there's quite a variation in size and the ways that they can run or fly. And also a little bit of variability in their tolerances. So if they tolerate wet conditions, dry conditions, and then also in what they eat. So if you think about it in that way, if we want a service of pest control in crops, then they're all having a range of different species adds up to better pest control, because whatever conditions you have, whatever pests outbreak in that year, weed seeds as well. So they will eat weed seeds. If you think about weed seeds, they are a food resource in fields. They are a fatty kind of protein-rich source of food for the plant to grow from. So carabid beetles, obviously being the hyenas that they are, will exploit that food resource as well, and they can eat quite a lot of weed seeds, up to 4,000 weed seeds per meter squared per day. That was referenced in the paper. So yes, if we have a variety of species in those habitats, it adds up to better ecosystem services of pest and weed control. So that is the thinking behind it. And the other part of this is that different life stages are important too. So the larvae of carabid beetles are dwelling within the soil. They grow over a season here. This diagram is a little bit complicated because we have multiple generations of adults that line along the top there. Usually I'm stood up in a room and I can point to the lines, but I can't. Oh, I don't know if you can see my pointer on the screen. But the top line here is the adults. And then when they get to the generation of the larva, we have a whole different generation here that overwinters as a larva. And then you get them pupating and coming into the next generation of adults. The point here being that the larvae are more abundant than the adults because they lay a lot more eggs than survive. And they are more voracious than the adults because they need a lot of protein to grow up into adult beetles. They're within the soil, in the place where a lot of the pests are in the larval stages. So they are providing a big ecosystem service as well, perhaps even more than the adults. So now getting into the scientific story here. Now, when I started my PhD, seems a very long time ago now, when you start your PhD, you review the literature. So what is known about your topic? And what was known at the time was that I described farm habitats as being disturbed in space, and that these disturbed habitats were thought to be a high mortality area for carabid beetles. And the semi-natural kind of the stable habitats at field edges, such as hedgerows and field margins, would have an abundance of beetles that spill over into the crop areas. So at the edge, you would see more beetles than in the center. So that being the known knowledge from the literature, my first piece of work showed me the exact opposite. So this was a data set coming from a trial on GM crops. Now, I didn't touch any of the data that dealt with the GM crops, but they measured absolutely everything to see what the other effects on species were. So they measured the carabid beetles over a range of crops over multiple time points across the UK. So it's a huge data set on carabid beetles. When you look at overall the data, you can see that distance from the field edge going upwards towards the right-hand side. You can see that in sugar beet, there's the most beetles in the field center. And if you just looked at the top part of that wedge, that is all of the beetles combined. But when you start to look at it by those different color segments, that's how I've separated the data into different species. And you start to see that these patterns are driven by what the beetles are responding to in the fields. So that beetle that's driving the data set towards being in the crop center mostly is actually the common black clock. And that's actually quite associated with disturbed environments and is the most abundant one in farm habitats overall. So it is the characteristic of the field center. Whereas you can see in the winter oilseed rape, there's a little wedge at the side. And obviously, if you've experienced oilseed rape, you'll know that there's often kind of defects at the edge of the field where it's very weedy. And that is the beetle Harpalus rufipes, which is the strawberry seed beetle, which is a seed eater. So it's inhabiting that habitat and looking for weed seeds in that area. So once you start to see that at a species level, you can see different trends, you can start to pick apart, what if we do this to influence where the beetles are in the fields? We can start to alter parts of our management to get beetles where we need them. So that's the first message. The species matters, and that can give us some clues on how to increase pest control in fields. Now, my big experiment for my PhD was based at the farm site in Harpenden. Now, this is a kind of non-typical farm because you can see those little fields that are kind of etched out in orange stripes there. They're all experimental fields that, including the longest running agricultural experiment in the world, may I add. So I couldn't use those fields, but of the existing field margins where I had from a previous PhD project, a mix of margins. So he had planted a moth margin because he was studying moths, but also a grass margin, a wildflower margin, and then an area at the edge as a kind of control. So I looked at what those margins were doing in terms of the carabid beetles, and looking at both into and out of the crops and adjacent habitats. I had standard pitfall traps, which is pretty much just a cut in the ground, beetle falls into it. and they die. But if you actually have a carabid beetle in a pot and another one falls in, they will eat each other. So unfortunately, I love beetles, but I have killed an awful lot of them. Because one big fat beetle in a pot isn't indicative of very much. So yes, standard pitfall traps, but also pitfall traps set down in the ground to measure what beetles and larvae were happening underground as well. So this was a large experiment that I did over 1 year with multiple runs of traps. And this is how the traps were set up. So I had pitfalls and subterranean pitfalls in transect lines, measuring what was happening in the margin. That zone where I said was the spillover zone, where we would expect to see a kind of hump before it declines into the field, and then the field center, to see if I could replicate that kind of trend that I'd seen before. That was quite surprising given the literature. And yes, I actually did see that same kind of trend that I'd seen before, but these are the model predictions. So without scaring you off too much with statistics, these are the predicted abundances up the left-hand side and the crop along the bottom. So spring barley, oats, spring oats, winter barley, winter oils. Oh, that was spring oilseed rape, winter barley, winter oilseed rape, and winter wheat. You can tell it's a long time since I did these statistics. But what we have here is it's split by the control of no margin, the grass margin, and the wildflower margin. So we have abundance and species richness. So when there was a grass margin at the side of the field, you can see those red X's of the measurements at the crop center, they stayed fairly stable. What we see is a change in what beetles are inhabiting the edge of the crop, so that kind of spillover zone. So when there's a grass margin, you can see that those beetles in the crop edge are less abundant, suggesting that there may be a slight barrier effect of grass margins where there's a crop and then a margin and then another crop. There may be a slight barrier effect. And then the other surprising thing was I expected wildflower margins to perform quite well in terms of they are diverse, they have a diverse range of alternative prey, and they have also pollen and other resources and wildflower seeds that carabids would eat. But when there was a margin, those measurements in the margin were less abundant. So those field margins aren't acting in the way that I expected them to, and wildflower margins may not be supporting carabids moving into crops. Now, that is not to say that field margins are not important in farm landscapes. I absolutely believe that they are, but it suggests that where we put field margins in a farmed landscape is important to the movements of carabid beetles into crops. And that's carabid beetles because most of the species are mostly not flying into crops. They are mostly walking into crops. So that's where I think that barrier effect might come from. And the other interesting thing from this data set was when I looked at those subterranean traps, I could see that the carabid larvae were actually more abundant where there wasn't a margin. And I think this has to do with the way that carabid beetles oviposit or put their eggs in the ground, and the kind of resources and way they move around in that habitat. But there was also this very interesting effect of that, I have to try and say that in the right way. Where there was a crop the year before that adults were abundant in this year, so we know that the adults like that crop, there were more larvae. So the crop from the previous year seemed to have a legacy effect on the larvae. Seemed to have, but we weren't actually measuring for that, so we can't say that for sure, but we have some follow-up work kind of looking at that kind of thing. So the other cool thing, I was only on the periphery of this project, but this is some work that we've done at Rothamsted Research, published, as you can see. And they set up camera traps with pollen beetles larvae stuck to those pieces of card, literally to see what would come to and predate on them. Because it's very hard to measure what's actually going on in farm systems. You have to think about how what you are measuring actually indicates what's actually happening. So camera traps are a really valuable tool. What was very surprising to the researchers who did this was that actually most of the predators come in and taking things from those cards were the carabid larvae. And that's surprising because we assumed that mostly they were active below ground, but they're cunning, I suppose, and they can see that there's a food resource of larval drop coming to the surface of the soil, and they move up to exploit that resource. So that's another cool thing about carabids. And the work following on from this is we have this transitions experiment where we are measuring over time different crops with an undersown treatment, clover and undersown. And we are measuring this year to year so we can see what the legacy effect might be. So we're doing subterranean trapping. So you can see that's what a subterranean trap looks like. It's like a pitfall trap, just set underground. And then we're getting the carabid larvae from those traps, and we are actually doing DNA metabarcoding to see what they've been eating. So we can link the whole kind of system up and see what they're doing in the crops and how they're inhabiting them over time. So that's going to be really interesting. So overall, this ends the carabid segment for now. The key messages: which species is very important, both in terms of the tolerances and providing different predation in fields, adding up to better services. Field margins might not be as important for carabids as previously assumed, and the placement of them might be important. And in-field habitats may be the most important. So actually supporting those species in the centre of the fields with in-field treatments might be the most important for getting them in the fields, which makes sense when you think about it. So, 1 second. Now to the next group of my beloved beetles, the dung beetles. So a lot of people, and I think that many people who attend this webinar will be aware of this, but a lot of people don't actually know that we have dung beetles in the UK. Having seen them on nature documentaries, rolling these dung balls across the African savannas. Dung beetles we define here as beetles that use dung to both eat and breed. There are other types of beetles that are associated with dung, but dung beetles are ones that both eat the dung as adults and also use it to raise their young. So although we don't have these ones that are called rollers that roll the balls in the UK, what we do have is dwellers. Hopefully that little video plays there. So the dwellers, I would say, are come about because the dung resources in temperate climates hang about a bit longer. So, and there's less competition for beetles to come in and secure that resource to breed in. So I haven't experienced it myself. I would love to one day go out and experience the kind of in arid habitats where they have a huge pile of, say, elephant dung, and it can disappear in the matter of hours because everything comes and gets that valuable resource. Now, in the UK, we are kind of up to the eyeballs in dung. So it does hang around a bit longer, and dwellers have time to dwell within the dung, eat it, for the adults eat it, but they also lay their eggs in the dung, and those develop within a few weeks into the adults, and then we've got the next generation there. You can see that there's a few different behaviors there that within the dung. Some dwell near the middle, some make little balls down near the bottom. But broadly speaking, we call these dwellers that live within the dung pile that raise the young there. And then we have the tunnelers. Now, like the rollers, these actually get a ball of dung from the main dung pile, but instead of rolling it away, they actually tunnel directly under the dung. And some species can go up to 2 meters below ground. They take that dung ball, make a chamber or multiple chambers in some species case, lay their eggs in those, and then they develop over time. Some species guard those tunnels. There's a lot of fascinating behaviors there that I could spend ages talking about. But you can see how that would be so beneficial for soil structure and nutrients. So taking those two groups into mind, if my slides want to skip, frozen a bit on them. Stopped working. If you bear with me a second, it just wants to restart. We can edit this out of the video. There's always some technical difficulty, isn't there? Should have started it from later on. There we go, you get to see my lovely slides all over again. There we go. Right, there we go. We're back on track. Is that working? Can I get a thumbs up from Stuart or Lottie?
Yes, it is working. Thank you.
So, back on track. Now, dung beetles, through those actions of the dwellers and the tunnelers, they break down dung quickly. And this reduces the amount of dung literally in the pastures, so that the available browsing area is increased there. They reduce the incidence of pest flies and worms within the pasture because they are literally taking the dung away. And also because they are eating the dung from the inside, they are actually drying out the dung as well, which reduces the habitat for the flies and worms. And through their actions of taking that dung and burying it, and they cycle the nutrients into the soil and into lower soil levels. And by doing that, they aerate the soil, which improves the sward growth and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Now, people have studied this a little bit, and we have some figures around this. So, not myself, these are arising from different scientists. So through all of those ecosystem services of dung beetles, they've been estimated to save the UK cattle industry over 367 million a year. Now, that was in 2015, so it's probably even more now. They reduce greenhouse gases in the dung and pasture ecosystems by up to 12%. And this is mostly due to the affecting the balance of greenhouse gases that are given off. So most of the damaging effects are from methane. So they reduce the balance of methane gases coming from that. And again, the message on biodiversity, that these diverse dung beetle communities add up to better ecosystem service provision. So always with the biodiversity, because that's how these systems arose. Going back to that diagram on the declines, though, you can see dung beetles are really topping out that vulnerable and endangered segment there. Which, strangely enough, though, dung beetles are not mentioned at all in the 2023 UK State of Nature report. I'm sure they're in some kind of statistic within that, but they are not mentioned explicitly. So maybe there will be this time now. They're gaining more ground. But the key impacts being wormer use, habitat loss and fragmentation, and less overwintering of livestock. So again, the message that we can definitely do something to help. And by helping them, we're helping ourselves. So the big actions that we can take. Now, there's not a lot of research done into dung beetles overall, but most of what exists is done on the use of wormers and the effects of those. So we do know this. This is not research that I've done, and this is adapted from Sarah Bainion's work at the Bug Farm. So we know that certain chemicals that we use, ivermectin-based wormers, are very damaging, the broad-scale ones. But we can take, and this advice is echoed by vets, and dung beetles farmers have quite a few vets' advice in them as well. Only treat animals that have a parasite burden, use less toxic chemicals when livestock are out on a pasture. Don't move animals onto a clean pasture immediately following treatment. Do not underdose. Stop rotations being used to break the parasite life cycles. Use different dose times, and make sure that there's always that kind of dung resource for beetles to persist in your farm landscape. And then, yes, always ask a vet about this. So I'm not the expert on that part of it, but these things all make sense in terms of reducing resistance buildup as well. It all just adds up. So what my areas of research are on is farm practices for dung beetles. What are the upcoming farm practices that we're seeing coming along through regenerative and agroecological kind of mindsets? These practices, how are they affecting dung beetles? So we've been looking primarily at silver pasture, herbal lays, and mob grazing. And you can see the wonderful science team from our site in Northwick in Devon doing some dung searches there, and a lovely baited pitfall trap. So I'll take you through these one by one. So I have done some work with the Devon Silver Pasture Network with Andy Gray of MC Kelly. So this was a farmer-led project because the Silver Pasture Network had arisen from trialing these new approaches with different layouts of trees. So we had 7 sites, and they were planted up with different kinds of trees, from like the lower browsing trees to the higher canopy trees that are all laid out. It's very nicely done, but they're laid out in these different kinds of systems. And what was very interesting to me was that these different layouts might affect the way that dung beetles move through these habitats. So we first had a kind of avenue system, which you might say was kind of classic silver pasture. And then we have this kind of clustered approach, the second one down, where there's like clusters of trees. There's a large cluster surrounded by two kind of clumps in a kind of pattern, and then a shelter belt kind of pattern. Now, dung beetles are very good flyers. They are mostly dispersing by flight, obviously, because dung is spatially kind of distributed over the landscape in such a way. But they both smell the dung resource. They have very good sense of smell with their antennas. But they actually have really good vision. There is some work into some of the dung beetles, the roller dung beetles, that they orientate themselves by the stars, which is a very beautiful concept. But they can actually see the way quite well. So how does that combine into how they are sensing the dung resources within a landscape, and how they are negotiating different layouts of trees? And my assumption is that dung beetles, particularly those ones that have evolved in a temperate ecosystem in the UK, what we had back before the advent of large-scale agriculture was a shift in mosaic landscape of grazing animals and trees. Now, the trees would senesce over time and degrade, so there would be a kind of mosaic of different pastures and woodlands in different stages of succession. So that was the natural kind of habitat that they evolved in. So I would assume that dung beetles would be evolved to persist in that kind of landscape, but we don't know the push points that we can use in terms of modern agriculture and silver pasture to make these systems really work for cattle and pest control and dung beetles all at the same time. How can we optimize that system? So we had the opportunity to monitor these from the start, that these are just sapling trees. You can see this is one of them. This is Andy Gray's farm with his beautiful cows. They are at that kind of stage where they're just getting to the point where the cows can be put in there. So we wanted to monitor that change over time and see what was happening. So the other thing is that we don't have enough entomologists to go around, and dung beetles are quite hard to identify. So we wanted to do this in the technological way, where farmers could actually just put out passive traps and record dung beetles over time. So these are some camera traps that we had just watching the piles of dung to see what was coming to them. And I have to say, after watching 3 hours straight of footage of dung, what mostly comes is a lot of flies. But it was I got very interested in flies over time. So the problem being, a lot of the time, this is from my last visit to the Natural History Museum, and this is a box of beetles that all look very similar to a human eye. So what we use are these dichotomous keys, where is it this or is it that? Is the scutellum long and are the legs a bit more bristly? And some of the time it goes on the male parts of the beetles. I don't expect farmers to be looking up beetle skirts, as it were. So we need better ways of identifying beetles. Now, AI isn't there yet as to being able to identify beetles from samples. It can get most of the way. But even if we can get down to groups of, so we have the dwellers as the first one in that lineup, and then we have the large tunnelers and the small tunnelers. So there's two types of tunnelers. But so we can tell between those groups quite easily. The difficult ones to identify are all kind of the dweller groups, the Aphodius species. So they all kind of look small and bullet-shaped. But even if we can get to the terms of, is it a dweller, is it tunneler, we can get that functional diversity that we were talking about a few slides back, and be able to inform on what these practices are doing for the ecosystem services. But a quick kind of side note, this slide illustrated my point, but it also tells you a little bit about dung beetles. So I'll go off on a slight tangent here, that if you want to know how to identify a dung beetle, they all have those clubbed antennae. So those clubbed antennae are what they are using to smell their way with. And actually the clubs kind of, you can see maybe, if you look, the clubs kind of open up into little fringes, and that's what they're using to smell, a large surface area there. They have broad legs that they're using to dig and tunnel and push their way through the dung. And the dung beetles, as I said, that both eat the dung and breed within the dung, all have this little distinct bit between their waistcoat section and their wing case section. So, but there are these other beetles of dung that aren't dung beetles. Very confusing here, isn't it? This is entomology for you. I'm dialing it way down with the entomological terms as well. So we have these other little ones in the right hand corner there, the water beetle and cloud beetles. They often come to very fresh dung, and whilst they eat dung, they don't. Their larvae do not eat the dung. They're actually predatory. So they are good guys, but they are not technically dung beetles. So there you go. So the other thing that we're doing at Rothamsted, I mentioned to you about cell grazing or mob grazing. The terms are somewhat interchangeable at the moment. I think that some people are working on getting a definition on there that works, but different kinds of swards. So this is the Rowden experiment at Rothamsted site at Northwick in Devon. And you can see that we've got plots that have cell grazing, so the stock is moved quite in time. You can see those distinctions. And then we have plots that are kind of standard kind of grass mix and then a biodiversity mix. So what we can see from the actual layout of the experiment is that we have this permanent pasture, a nature-based kind of what you would think of as a kind of diverse sward, and then an agri-tech sward. We also have drained and undrained plots. That was due to a different experiment. And then we have cell grazing and continuous stocking as well. So we have all these different treatments. We're measuring all of the kind of inputs and outputs of these plots, now including the dung beetles. So we're measuring those over time and seeing the differences between the treatments. No results as of yet, but watch this space. There is some interesting research out coming from this experiment about the different approaches of and how that adds up to ecosystem services more broadly. So you can look into that if you like. I will say that the last year of sampling, the nature-based mix didn't come out very well, so we didn't have very good data on that. So we're just seeing how that goes over time. And we also had this really interesting collaboration with the Morden Institute with my student Genevieve. Now, this is the greengrass experiment, which you can see is very similar in setup. You can just about tell in some of those plots that there's a kind of gradient where you can see that they've done the cell grazing. And they've got similar kind of biodiversity rotation and rye. And it made us feel a little bit better that their biodiversity mix didn't take off very well either. But what we did, we went up to Scotland and we went and sampled those fields for both dung beetles and then saw the parasite burden in those plots as well. So there were sheep on that experiment at the time. And early results are actually quite interesting, that we are seeing a little bit of difference there. So I don't want to give anything away at this stage, but there might be some interesting things to come out of that collaboration as well. So I mentioned very briefly my student Genevieve there. She's working a little bit on herbal lays for dung beetles. So what she's done is taken a standard kind of grass mix versus a less well-established herbal lay and a very high quality diverse herbal lay. And laid them out over a field scale and literally just removed pats over time and deconstructed them and counted the beetles. And what she's found so far is very interesting in terms of that there's not much difference in the species richness, but the abundance of very high quality herbal lays is very different to the control of a standard kind of grass mix. But there's not much difference on a not very well established or poorer established herbal lay that isn't so diverse. It almost seems like in terms of if you can't establish the herbal lay very well, then it's a moot point for the dung beetles. You may as well just have a standard pasture. So she also looked a little bit into the qualities of dung of these different types, and there wasn't much a difference within the actual kind of what do you call it, the texture. There's a better word for it, and the moisture content. So she assumes that this is something to do with the volatile organic compounds that are coming from those species within the herbal lays. So there's a lot more work to be done there. So we're really interested in that. We want to look also, and there's not a lot of older silver pasture about, but we're very interested in these very mature systems. How does that interact with the beetle diversity? And then the real specifics of cell and mob grazing, how does that interact with how dung beetles are over time, and the kind of the interactions of that with the life, with the worm burdens and such, like the parasitic burdens. So I think there's a lot more to look at in terms of that. But this is all very early work. We absolutely know more about dung beetles in tropical climates than we do in temperate climates, even though we are so dependent on them. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And I will say there's a lot that farmers can help us understand about this. So do get out there and look at your own dung beetles. So this leads very well into my point. Get involved. Science and sustainable agriculture needs you. We need to know what what farmers are doing in their fields that really works. Because there's a lot of nuance in different people's practices. What works in one area might not work in another. And there's a lot of nuance in how people do particular practices as well. So we need a lot of data to drive behind our understanding of these underpinning processes and how it works in practice. Because we can do a lot in the lab, we can do a lot of kind of very specific things, but how it works in a real field environment with all the different factors that come in a real world scenarios is very different. And that's how it's supposed to work. So we need that data, that real world data. This is the Ag Zero project that I'm mainly funded on. So we have those farm labs, those experiments like the Rowden that I showed you. We surround that with an innovation farm network where we're looking at actual practices, such as we have been going out and sampling from people who have herbal leys and seeing what the interactions of that is with the whole farm biodiversity. And then surrounding all of that at a larger scale, but with less effort, because we don't have very many people to go around and sample everything, we have citizen scientist farmers. So people who are going and collecting data and telling us what they found. So that is the aspiration, get that real big data to find out what's happening. So what I've done was carabid beetles. They have that same kind of dichotomous key that's very confusing. But I looked at the top species in farmland and made an easy to interpret identification guide, which has been so popular. We're nearly out of copies again. And a protocol for monitoring carabid beetles in farms that is easy. So you only need to do a minimum of 3 traps. And if you want to do more traps in more fields, it's very scalable as to what you particularly want to find out, as well as informing what I would like to find out about how beetles are working with different people's treatments and farm management practices. So that was the pilot kind of scheme, and we can see that a lot of people got involved in the pilot. It was really successful. Everyone really liked the protocol on the first go. I thought I might have to alter stuff, but clearly I was thinking straight on that day. So that was really successful. And I got farmers sending me actual pictures of the carabids that they'd found. Note here that they were finding the same kind of pattern that we found, that there's less in the field margins, more in the field centres. That's very preliminary data, but still seeing that same trend. And they were able to get down to quite a good level. Now, this is data that they used recording in the CEH eSurveyor app. So this is available if you have the CEH app. It's available widely now. You can scroll along to the carabid app and you can record and input into this data set. If you would kindly do so, that would be fantastic. So what we're working towards is getting enough images to train an AI identification system, because for beetles that look so similar as some carabid species do, and for beetles that are upside down and not showing their key identification markers, it trains the AI that is going on more information than a human eye, like proportions and all that kind of stuff, to identify these beetles. But we need a very big data set of images to do that. So this is contributing to that as well. But at the moment, it's a drop-down list that works with the ID guide. And there are, if you don't have access to the guide, which we're almost running out of, then the key information about those species is available in the app as well. So over time, I have spoken at a lot of events, and this is one of my proudest moments at the big tent at Groundswell. Got so many people interested in beetles, as noted by your kind attendance today at the webinar. Over my career as an applied entomologist, over 16,000 people engaged with insect science and the message, the good message about beneficial beetles. So I've been doing that with an aim to get this message out there, get people involved in monitoring beetles on their own farm. But I want to understand, how can we help farmers to help beetles? How do we give that most robust advice that's informed by those big data sets? How do we figure out what farmers can do that's really effective? What are the best ways to put that information across? What is the best format? And what is the best ways for farmers to monitor that change? Not all farmers may have the time to go out and look at beetles themselves. Technology can help us on that front as well. So those are the main kinds of outcomes that I would like for this work. I want to be able to help farmers to do the best that will then feed back into the best for their farm as well. What I found is, so far, farmers are willing and able to monitor beetles on their own farms, but there's still some problems with the system that we have. Technology and actual on-the-ground stuff. So what I'll be doing next is surveys. It's all about surveys, but it's the best way to collect data on what people think and feel and their experiences. So look out for that. Hopefully you'll be kind enough to fill that in if you receive one. And then I'll be running identification workshops with set beetle specimens. And I've done 2 of these so far, and they've been really fun, actually. I expected that people get tired of looking at beetles quite quickly, but they wanted more time even. So I got these farmers. You can see this is my event in Devon, and they were looking at dishes of beetles. They were trying to use the phone app or a printed guide to identify those dishes of beetles, and then telling me what they thought about that experience. And the next thing that I'll be doing is doing one-to-one farm visits, following farmers around and seeing how they use these tools in practice, to understand how they use them, what their perceptions are, them, without too much input from myself. So maybe someone at this webinar will volunteer for me to come and follow you around on your farm. But I'll be doing that this autumn, so watch out for that. So yes, that leads into a plug for my upcoming workshop on the 11th of March. So this is free to attend, and you also get a bonus tour of Rothamsted to see some of the other exciting sites that is going on. So do join up for that if you would like to. I think we might be planning more events with the Nature Friendly Farming Network, perhaps over this summer, and maybe getting out doing some dung beetling. So watch that space there as well. Oh yes, so this is what I did with a Kent group, going out and looking at dung beetles. And sometimes it's a bit of a hard sell to get people to look through dung, but actually once people get involved in it, it's a little bit like a treasure hunt. You may have to take my word for it, but it is so exciting when you see a big shiny beetle and I found a tunnel there. It's yeah, I always have good experiences going out there, getting people's, well, I'd say getting the hands dirty. I do provide gloves, so that's always a lot of fun. So yeah, that leads us into questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. That was very insightful and absolutely fascinating what goes on in the unseen world beneath the grass and the soil in the farm systems. And just want to show I've got one of your books here, so I don't know, there must be,
Oh.
yeah. I'm pleased to have it if they're going so quickly. Um, So yes, thank you again for that. That was really good. And yeah, yes, thank you for mentioning the dung beetle workshop that's going to be in West Sussex on the 28th of May, I think. And yeah, that'll be soon be going on our Eventbrite page as well on our website, and sometime in March. So yeah, I think we've got some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with one because I had a similar question. I think it's from David. Are dung beetles active in all types of livestock dung?
Yes, there is some difference from the literature again. You have to always be careful of the literature. It's known that cattle dung generally has the most species associated with it and the most abundance. But in my experience, and I will say this was deer that were grazing on herbal lays as well, so double whammy, that had the most abundance and species richness within it. But there is definitely a difference because of the different grazing strategies, the different kind of mostly the moisture content actually is quite attractive to the dung beetles because the adult dung beetles, hope everyone's had their dinner already, actually don't so much chew on the fiber content, but they actually more suck the juices of the dung. So that can be quite important in coming to fresh dung, and the cattle dung, as you know, is a lot more moist, so that generally does get a lot of species. But different species will have different preferences as well as preferences for the age of dung. So if you're sampling dung on a farm, you want to take into account the different livestock that you have and also different ages of dung throughout the pasture, and look at all of that when you're doing a good sift.
Right. And there's another question from another David Thring, who I know is a vineyard manager in Kent. He mentioned, is there data on till versus no till when it comes to Caribbean beetles, I guess?
Yes, there is. I actually have done some research on this myself, not featured in this presentation, because it was very kind of preliminary. So we had plots with tilled versus no tilled over different crop treatments. And the tillage system had only been established for 1 year at that time. And again, the distinctions between the species, when I looked at the species as a whole, there was no difference in carabid beetles overall. But when you look at it at a species by species level, some species were benefited by the no-till systems, particularly the larger violet ground beetle, which is associated with eating slugs and snails. That's around a 3 centimeter one. So it's one of the most showy of the carabid beetles. It's got a lovely violet hue to the edges of its wing cases. And those ones were associated with lower till systems, and we assumed that was because of the surface chaff. The experiment hadn't been established long enough to see differences in the carabid larvae affected by tillage, but that is likely to be quite a strong effect over time because tillage will alter the environment not only for carabid larvae, but also, depending on the timing, direct mortality, because you're turning over that soil, you will be chopping up some of them, but also reducing that habitat and affecting the balance of the below ground diversity and the kind of species that are alternative prey in that habitat. So yes, tillage does have a massive effect on carabid beetles, to summarize, but there is limited data so far.
Okay, thank you. Question from Sarah. When is the best time to monitor, or can you monitor every month? And is there peak times, summer, autumn, winter?
Yes, there are definitely better times, but You see, this is the thing, it's always balancing when you come to measure anything. It's balancing the effort with the outcomes. In terms of scientists, we don't have a lot of time spare, so we're always trying to balance when we should sample to get the most data possible. In terms of carabid beetles, there are two main breeding seasons, and so two main activity peaks. So we have spring breeders and autumn breeders. Now, you remember that very complicated slide that I showed you with the kind of larva being overwintering and then pupating into the adults for the summertime and then becoming the next generation. Though that was based on the autumn breeders, which are the most abundant ones in farm habitats, including the black clock species that was at the top of that kind of graph in the sugar beet. But we also have the spring breeders that they overwinter as adults, and then they lay their larvae in the spring and they develop over the summer and come into the new generation like that. So in a very long-winded way of explaining this, we would mostly measure in late spring to take in the generation of the spring breeders, and then kind of late summer to take in the generation of the autumn breeders. And then you get an idea of the most biodiversity that you can with just two measures. But if you was just going to choose one sample time, then I would go for the autumn kind of breeders and go for maybe sampling in August, September time. That would be the peak for arable carabids.
Okay, thank you. And does that apply, sorry if I missed that, does that apply to dung beetles as well? Because Harriet's asked the question, how much dung do beetles need over winter to survive? I'm guessing because some
how much?
Inside in the winter.
Yes, that overwintering of livestock inside is said to be quite an issue, but there's really not the research to put any figures around it. That's the problem. And the assemblages that we have now have come from many years of livestock being managed in the same ways that they're managed now. So yes, the species that didn't deal very well with that in the beginning have dropped out quite a lot. So you over time. But in terms of how much do they need? And so the question was when to measure the dung beetles and how much do they need over the winter. So as much as you can possibly manage without compromising your farm system, I would say. Just having a little bit out there is going to help whatever's there to persist. But in terms of when to sample for them, there is more of a range of activity throughout the year. But I would say same kind of sample windows and maybe more measurements over time just to take in the different species abundances. Going maybe more into the autumn time, so September, October might be peak timing for them, but throughout the year certainly.
Okay, thank you. Question from Nick. Why do you say don't underdose among the more expected advice?
Because I'm no expert in this, but because if you underdose, then you are exposing things to a minimal level of insecticide or chemical. And this is true for any kind of resistance buildup. And then they develop a little bit of resistance to it. And if you're underdosing over time, you're not wiping out the whole of the population of something. So some of them survive, and the ones that survive are the resistant ones. And then you get that new generation coming in that are resistant, and that's where the resistance buildup comes into practice. So underdosing can produce that kind of follow-on effect. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Hope it does to Nick as well. So Andrew has posed a question. Is the distribution and abundance of carabids linked to soil microbial biomass? If there's a positive relationship, should our priority be improving soil health ahead of creating more space for nature?
Can you just read that again? Sorry.
Yep, sure.
To make sure I've understood it properly.
That's okay. Is the distribution and abundance of caribids linked to soil microbial biomass? And if so,
Yeah.
if there's a positive relationship, should our priority be improving soil health ahead of creating more space for nature?
I would suspect that there is. Nothing has been proven. And in fact, I know a soil microbiologist who has had this conversation with me, and we think it would be pretty cool to do. But nothing is proven on that front. Certainly, there is an interaction of that on the way that insects digest their food, for instance, and we know a little bit about that. So, having a positive association would definitely increase the survivorship of both the adults and the larvae that are developing in soil. But we do not know how strong that relationship is. And I will say that caravid beetles are very adapted to change, as I've mentioned, so they may be less strongly affected by it than, say, rove beetles. Rove beetles are very similar in their niche than carabids, but they are a lot more dependent on soil health. But they are likewise quite predatory, but also live within the soil. So that might be a stronger association. Just going off, I'm thinking completely off the top of my head here, but that might be something. In terms of the balance of soil health and habitats, soil health is really the underpinning of all habitats, isn't it? And these systems are all within balance as a part of this kind of jigsaw of the ecosystems working in harmony. And I would say all parts of that system working together means that it all links up in the right way. The triggers of push and pull of which we do in an agroecological approach, you can twist one more than the other. But I would say that it was down to specifics of what works for each farmer as to what triggers they pull. If you're looking for absolute optimum, I don't think that natural systems would really work in that way. That's my musings on it anyway. But I think that it's all part of a system that ties up and ties in with each other. Biodiversity at the soil level, biodiversity at the landscape level. It's all part of the same parcel of things. Hope that kind of made sense. A bit philosophical too.
I know, that's very good. Thank you, Kelly. Just to say, we're over by 10 minutes now. I think we've a few people have since gone. We're going to have a couple more questions and let everyone go. And maybe we could do a blog at some point on beetles to answer any unanswered questions. So I'm just going to choose a couple more. Chris said, how do we sign up to the farmer trials? Is that contacting you directly or is that through?
Oh, yes. So the information on the workshop at Rothamsted is on Rothamsted's website. And then if I think that my contact details would be on that link, but if not, you can get in touch with Rothamsted Comms and they will pass on the message to me that you're interested in being involved. So that would be really nice if people would do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got time for one more. A different question, this one from Mike Dixon. How important are these creatures, as in the beetles, as a food source for wild birds? As you know, most wild birds are sadly plummeting and have been doing so for the last 50 plus years.
Absolutely essential is the answer. Absolutely essential. In fact, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust have their chick food index of how habitats can be altered to produce food for farmland bird chicks. And that is heavily weighted towards caravid beetles as a food resource. We know that dung beetles are very important in the diet of choughs, particularly, but all sorts of farmland birds will feed on caravid beetles and dung beetles. Bats as well are very associated with dung beetles. Excellent food resource. And you will often see, I've seen going out into fields, buzzards picking over dung pats because the dung beetle larvae are actually a bit bigger than the adults even. So they're really chunky food resource for birds. And you will see that dung pats are often picked apart for this fantastic resource for birds. not good news for the dung beetles, but they do get by if there's quite a lot of them about. So yes, absolutely supports farmland birds. You muted, Stuart.
Sorry, I'm just going to squeeze one more in before we go from Christine, who says we have grass margins, beetle banks, and flower strips through fields, but from your research, it appears that these might actually be barriers to the Caribbean beetles.
Yes, like I say, it's very early kind of days, and this is why we need the big data sets from farmers, looking at how these different, like the beetle banks, the different types of margins are interacting with what they are seeing in their fields, to really pick apart why I saw that effect over our experiments, and how this interacts with the surrounding landscape as well, and what different crops you have in the field and over time as well. What we took away from that experiment was, I never want to be quoted saying that field margins are bad. Field margins are definitely good, but there might be ways that we can think about where we put them in the farm landscape and how the habitats interact to make sure that beetles can move into crops and around crops more effectively. But there are definitely other invertebrates that will be in those field margins that will be moving into crops as well, such as ladybirds, such as the rove beetles, such as hoverflies and their larvae. You know, it's a lot, and also spiders. They are really huge predators and of pest controllers in fields. These are all using those field margins, and how they interact with it as well. We're just starting to pick that apart with science. We're getting that kind of real idea from the data, but also the new technologies coming in to monitor what's actually happening in fields, to start to pick apart what works, how we put things in best, and how it all joins together. So don't take your margins out.
No. Good advice. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, I think we're going to have to call it a day there. We've overrun a little bit, but yeah, really good questions. Thank you, Kelly, for the answers as well. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, please have a look at the links in the chat before you go. But I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you very much. Good night.